The steps were concrete, but Marcus counted them like they were made of time. 1, 2, 3, 4, the rhythm that told his body it was safe to stop moving. 5, 6, 7, the number of years since he'd slept in a bed that wasn't borrowed from charity. 8, 9, 10, the steps to the door of Sacred Heart Shelter, where they knew his name and didn't ask questions that required answers about the space between brilliant and broken. Marcus Rivera settled onto step number 4 because it was wide enough for his shoulders and high enough to keep his feet dry when the city washed itself with rain. His jacket, wool once, optimism now, wrapped around him like an apology he'd learned to wear. In his breast pocket, a worn notebook held equations that could solve traffic flow and pension calculations and the orbital mechanics of satellites, but not the problem of how a man with a PhD in applied mathematics ends up counting steps to stay sane. The shelter opened at 6. Marcus woke at 5:30 because habits die harder than pride. And he had been a morning person when morning meant lecture halls and coffee that came in mugs instead of paper cups that burned your fingers. He stretched against the concrete, joints protesting in languages he'd learned from sleeping on surfaces that didn't forgive, and watched the city decide whether it wanted to be dawn or just another version of dark. At 5:47, a car pulled up, small, dented, with bumper stickers that said things like "coexist" and "my other car is a bicycle." The driver sat for a moment, checking her phone, organizing something on the passenger seat, and Marcus recognized the ritual of someone preparing to face people whose problems were larger than the solutions she carried in her bag. Emma Chen stepped out of the car, 22 years old and wearing responsibility like a lab coat that was still too big for her. She had volunteered at Sacred Heart for 8 months, ever since graduating with a degree in social work, and discovering that helping people was harder and more necessary than the textbooks had made it sound. She carried a medical bag because someone had to check blood pressure and remind people to take insulin and clean wounds that came from living on surfaces the city hadn't designed for human bodies. She didn't look at Marcus as she unlocked the shelter door. Volunteers learned quickly not to make eye contact until they were ready to hear the stories that lived in the spaces between sleeping and waking. She flipped lights, started coffee, arranged intake forms on a folding table, and prepared to spend another morning pretending she could save everyone who walked through the door. Marcus waited. The shelter had rules about crowding the entrance, about maintaining dignity in the queue for help, about remembering that charity worked better when it felt less like charity. He counted the windows in the building across the street, 12, and multiplied by the number of floors, 6, and divided by the probability that anyone behind those windows knew his name or cared whether he made it through another night. The math was unkind. At exactly 6 o'clock, Emma opened the door. "Good morning," she said to the gathering crowd, voice steady in the way that meant she had practiced being someone people could trust with their worst mornings. "Coffee's ready. Sign-in sheets are on the table. Medical checks are optional, but recommended." Marcus entered fourth in line because being first made you look desperate and being last made you look difficult, and he had learned the mathematics of fitting in without standing out. He signed his name in handwriting that still looked like it belonged to a professor, accepted coffee in a cup that had been donated by a church that put its phone number on the bottom, and found a chair near the window where he could watch Emma work. She moved between people like a careful dancer, checking blood pressure on a man whose hands shook from something stronger. Then caffeine withdrawal, giving insulin instructions to a woman who kept her diabetes supplies in a backpack. She never let leave her lap, listening to a teenager explain why his cough wasn't getting better with the patience of someone who knew that being heard was half the medicine. Marcus watched her hands, steady, quick, gentle when they needed to be. He watched her face, young enough to still be surprised by suffering, old enough not to be derailed by it. He watched the way she wrote notes in a composition book, neat handwriting that documented names and conditions and follow-up appointments like she was keeping score in a game where everyone was supposed to win. And then she looked at him, recognition in a medical bag. Emma's pen stopped moving. Her breath caught the way it does when you see a ghost that turns out to be alive, and sitting 3 feet away from you in a homeless shelter drinking coffee from a donated church cup. "Marcus?" she said, and the name sounded like a question that had been waiting 8 years to be asked. Marcus looked up from his coffee, and in that moment the careful mathematics of anonymity collapsed. Emma Chen had been Emma Rivera when she was 14 and furious, when she'd stood in a family court and told a judge that she'd rather live with strangers than with a father who loved numbers more than he loved being present. She'd changed her name when her foster parents adopted her, not to hurt him, but to practice being someone who didn't carry the weight of his choices. "Emma," he said back, and her name and his voice sounded like an apology that had been rehearsing itself in homeless shelters and subway stations and the space between sleep and morning for 8 years. The shelter continued its morning routine around them. Coffee was poured, forms were signed, people found corners to exist in while the city decided what kind of day it wanted to be. But in the bubble between Marcus's chair and Emma's medical bag, time had stopped to let them figure out how to be father and daughter in a place where both of those words had different meanings than they'd had when she was small enough to sit on his lap while he worked on equations that seemed more important than bedtime stories. "You're," Emma started, then stopped because the sentence could end with homeless or sick or old or any number of observations that weren't questions and weren't accusations but weren't safe either. "Here," Marcus finished for her. "I'm here." She sat, down in the chair across from him, medical bag in her lap like armor. "How long?" she asked. "At Sacred Heart? 2 years. Before that, I moved around." He set his coffee cup on the table between them. "How long have you been volunteering here?" 8 months. She paused. "I didn't know you were… I would have… What? Not volunteered? Switched shelters? Pretended not to see me?" Marcus's voice was careful, not angry, just tired in the way that comes from carrying conversations you've imagined but never had. "Emma, I've been homeless for 6 years. The chances of us never running into each other were never as good as I hoped they were." Emma opened her medical bag, not because she needed anything from it, but because her hands needed something to do while her brain processed the mathematics of coincidence and the probability that this moment had been inevitable since the day she'd started volunteering at the place where her father, it turned out, had been staying alive. "Are you…" She gestured vaguely at him, looking for a polite way to ask if he was okay, if he was sick, if he was dying, if he needed help, if he wanted help, if he would accept help from her specifically. "Healthy enough," Marcus said. "Blood pressure's high. Sleep isn't great. I should probably take better care of my heart, but cardiologists don't take insurance from the School of Hard Knocks." Emma's hands found her stethoscope automatically. If you want, I can check your vitals. Just routine, like everyone else." Marcus looked at the stethoscope, then at his daughter's face, then at the space between them that was filled with 8 years of silence and hurt and the kind of love that doesn't know how to exist without causing pain. "Okay," he said. "But just because you're a good volunteer, not because I'm your father." "Okay," Emma agreed, and wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm with the professional gentleness she'd learned in school, and the careful tenderness she'd inherited from him, though neither of them said that out loud. The daughter who became a stranger. The blood pressure cuff whispered against Marcus's arm as Emma pumped it full of air and watched the gauge with the focused attention she gave to everyone, but with hands that shook slightly because muscle memory is stronger than 8 years of practice at being someone else's daughter. 160/95, she said, writing the numbers in her composition book next to his name. "That's high." "It's been higher," Marcus said, rolling his sleeve down. "Stress is an expensive hobby when you can't afford therapy." Emma wanted to ask what he was stressed about, but she already knew the answer would be a list that included sleeping outside and finding food and staying safe, and probably seeing his daughter for the first time in 8 years while she checked his vital signs in a homeless shelter. Instead, she said, "Do you take anything for it?" "Can't afford medication." "Can't afford a doctor to prescribe medication I can't afford. It's a very efficient system once you understand the mathematics." She wrote something else in her notebook, a note to herself, or a reminder, or maybe just the word medication in handwriting that looked like his when he used to help her with homework at a kitchen table, in a house they'd lost when the numbers in his bank account stopped adding up to rent. "There are programs," Emma said. "Sliding scale clinics, community health centers. I could…" She stopped herself before offering to help, because offering to help meant acknowledging that he needed help, meant acknowledging that he was her father, meant acknowledging that she cared whether he lived or died. And she wasn't ready for that equation yet. "I know about the programs," Marcus said gently. "I have a PhD in applied mathematics, Emma. I can navigate bureaucracy. The problem isn't that I don't know how to get help. The problem is that getting help requires admitting I need it, and admitting I need it requires admitting that I failed at things that used to be easy. A man approached their table with a cough that sounded like gravel and a request for throat lozenges. Emma turned to help him, grateful for the interruption and the excuse to be a volunteer instead of a daughter for a few minutes. Marcus watched her work, efficient, kind, thorough, and saw the girl who used to organize his desk when he was too lost in equations to remember where he'd put his pencils. She'd grown up to be exactly the kind of person he'd hoped she would become, which made it harder to be proud and easier to be ashamed. When the man with the cough moved on, Emma returned to her chair and her notebook, and the conversation that hung between them like a mathematical proof with steps missing. "Why didn't you contact me?" she asked, not looking at him. When your situation changed." Marcus considered several answers. Because he was ashamed, because he didn't want her to see him like this, because he'd convinced himself she was better off without him, because calling would have required admitting that losing custody wasn't the worst thing that had happened to him. He settled on the truth. "Because I was afraid you'd help me," he said. "And I was afraid you wouldn't." Emma looked up from her notebook. "That doesn't make sense." "Sure it does. If you helped me, it would mean you still cared, and I'd have to carry the guilt of knowing I'd put you in a position where you felt obligated to save your homeless father. If you didn't help me, it would mean I was right to think you were better off without me, but it would also mean I'd lost you completely instead of just temporarily." He shrugged. "Both options were terrible math. So you chose not to call. I chose to let you be Emma Chen instead of Emma Rivera. I chose to let you have a life that didn't include managing my mistakes." Emma was quiet for a long moment, pen tapping against her notebook in a rhythm that sounded like the metronome he'd used to help her practice piano when she was 7, and believed that if she just practiced hard enough, she could make any song sound beautiful. "I missed you," she said finally, and the words came out smaller than she'd intended but truer than most things she'd said in 8 years. "I missed you too," Marcus said. "Every day." I counted. Numbers that don't add up to love. The shelter filled with morning routines, breakfast served on paper, plates, social workers checking in with regular clients, someone arguing quietly with someone else about whose turn it was to use the phone. Emma moved through her medical checks like a dancer who'd learned the choreography by heart. Blood pressure, temperature, visual inspection for injuries or infections, gentle questions about symptoms and medications and when they'd last seen a real doctor. Marcus stayed in his chair by the window and watched her work and remembered the girl who used to bring him coffee when he was grading papers late at night, who would curl up in the chair beside his desk and do her homework while he worked on research that seemed important enough to justify missing dinner again. When Emma finished her morning rounds, she returned to the table where Marcus sat with his empty coffee cup and his notebook full of equations that solved everything except the problem of how to live. "What do you do?" she asked, nodding toward the notebook. "I mean, during the day, when you're not here." "I tutor sometimes, kids who need help with math. I charge $10 an hour, cash only, and I meet them at the library because their parents don't want me in their houses." Marcus opened the notebook and showed her a page covered with calculus problems. "This is homework for a kid named Tyler who wants to be an engineer. His mother thinks I'm going to steal something, but she can't afford a real tutor, so she tolerates me." Emma looked at the equations. Clean, precise, the handwriting of a man who still believed that mathematics could solve problems if you just arranged the numbers correctly. Do you miss teaching?" "Every day, but I miss other things more." "Like what?" Marcus closed the notebook and set it on the table between them. "Like having a daughter who knew my phone number. Like being someone she was proud to introduce to her friends. Like being the kind of father who showed up to school plays and parent-teacher conferences and didn't disappear for 3 days because the equations in his head were louder than the sound of her calling his name." Emma's hands stilled on her pen. "You had an addiction. I had a lot of addictions. Gambling was just the one that cost the most money. You lost our house. I lost our house. I lost your college fund. I lost your mother's trust and your respect, and the right to call myself your father without it sounding like a joke." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing the mathematics of blame and forgiveness and the compound interest of 8 years of hurt. "Mom used to say you loved numbers more than you loved us. Your mother was wrong about a lot of things, but she was right about that." Marcus looked out the window at the city waking up. People walking to jobs and appointments and lives that had structures more reliable than the charity of strangers. I thought if I could just solve one more equation, win one more bet, find the right mathematical formula for success, I could give you everything you deserved. I didn't understand that what you deserved was a father who was present more than he was brilliant. I used to think you'd come back, Emma said. After the custody hearing, after I moved in with the Chens, I used to think you'd get clean and get a job and come back and ask for another chance. I thought about it. Every day for 2 years I thought about it. But then I'd imagine showing up at your door, and I'd imagine you having to choose between giving me another chance to disappoint you or telling me to leave and carrying the guilt of turning your father away. Both options were terrible math. So you stayed away. I stayed away. And I told myself it was because I loved you too much to put you through watching me fail again. But really, it was because I loved myself too little to risk finding out that you might not forgive me. Emma wrote something in her notebook. Not medical information this time. Just words that she needed to put somewhere, other than the space between her heart and her throat. I used to be angry at you for not trying. And now I'm angry at you for not trusting me to make my own choice about whether to forgive you. Marcus looked at his daughter, 22 years old, wearing a name that wasn't his, carrying a medical bag full of supplies to help strangers, sitting in a homeless shelter with the father she'd taught herself not to need, and realized that she'd grown up to be someone who could handle hard truths and complicated mathematics and the kind of forgiveness that doesn't come with guarantees. Emma, he said, if I asked for another chance, what would the math look like? She was quiet for a long moment, pen tapping against her notebook in the rhythm of someone calculating probabilities and risks and the compound interest of love that's been invested badly, but never completely withdrawn. Before she could answer, Marcus's hand went to his chest, and his face went pale, and the mathematics of their conversation suddenly became much simpler and much more urgent. The equation of emergency rooms. The pain started as a whisper and became a shout in the space of 3 heartbeats. Marcus's coffee cup hit the floor and shattered into pieces that would cut someone's feet later, but he was too busy trying to breathe to calculate the probability of injury to innocent bystanders. Emma was moving before his cup finished breaking. Medical bag open, cell phone in her hand, voice calm in the way she'd been trained to be when calm was the difference between panic and professional response. I need an ambulance at Sacred Heart Shelter, 1247 Oak Street, 50-something male, chest pain, possible cardiac event. Patient is conscious and responsive. She knelt beside Marcus's chair and pulled out a small bottle of aspirin. Can you swallow? She asked, putting a tablet in his palm. Chew it. Don't swallow it whole. It'll help if this is what I think it is. Marcus chewed the aspirin and tasted chalk and regret, and the bitter irony of his daughter saving his life in a homeless shelter 8 years after he'd ruined hers, with the arrogance of believing mathematics could solve problems that required presence instead of proof. Rate the pain. 1 to 10, Emma said, checking his pulse with fingers that were steady even though her voice was starting to shake. 7, maybe 8. Marcus tried to sit up straighter and felt the pain shift from whisper to scream. Emma, I need you to... No, don't, she interrupted. Don't say goodbye. Don't make this about guilt or forgiveness or 8 years of missed phone calls. You're having a heart attack, and I'm your daughter. And right now, the only math that matters is keeping you alive until the paramedics get here. The ambulance arrived in 6 minutes, which was faster than average for this part of the city, but felt like 6 hours to both of them. 2 paramedics, a man and a woman who moved with the efficient choreography of people, who had learned that seconds mattered more than comfort, took over Emma's careful triage with equipment that beeped and analyzed and reduced Marcus Rivera to a series of numbers on a screen. You did good, the female paramedic told Emma as they loaded Marcus onto a stretcher. The aspirin probably saved him some muscle damage. You know CPR? Basic certification. I'm a social work student, I volunteer here. You family? Emma looked at Marcus, whose eyes were closed but whose hand was reaching toward her like a question. Yes, she said, taking his hand. I'm his daughter. At the hospital, Emma filled out forms with information she had to guess at. Insurance, none. Next of kin, her, apparently. Medical history, high blood pressure, probably other things he hadn't mentioned. Emergency contact, her cell phone number, which felt like a promise she wasn't sure she was ready to make. The doctor who came to talk to her was younger than she'd expected and older than she felt, with the kind of tired eyes that came from telling people news they didn't want to hear in waiting rooms that smelled like disinfectant and fear. He had a moderate heart attack, the doctor said, sitting in the plastic chair next to Emma's. We got him stabilized, and the EKG shows the damage wasn't as extensive as it could have been. The aspirin you gave him probably prevented a more serious outcome. Is he going to be okay? He needs surgery. A simple procedure, angioplasty, to open the blocked artery. After that, medication, lifestyle changes, follow-up care. The prognosis is good if he follows the treatment plan. Emma nodded, processing the mathematics of recovery and the variables of compliance, and the probability that her homeless father would be able to follow a treatment plan that required stable housing and regular meals and medication that cost more than the $10 an hour he made tutoring kids whose parents didn't trust him in their houses. There's one complication, the doctor continued. He doesn't have insurance. The surgery alone will cost about $30,000. The hospital has charity care programs, but they're complicated, and they usually require a permanent address, Emma finished. Someone to ensure compliance with follow-up care. Someone to be responsible. Exactly. Emma looked through the waiting room window at the city she'd grown up in. The city that had given her foster parents who became real parents and a college education and a career helping people who fell through the cracks her father had disappeared into. She thought about the mathematics of obligation and choice and the compound interest of love that doesn't know how to stop calculating, even when the numbers don't add up to easy answers. I'll be responsible, she said. Paper trails and blood relations. The paperwork was more complicated than the surgery. Forms that asked for relationships and addresses and guarantees that sounded like promises Emma wasn't sure she could keep. She sat in the hospital cafeteria with coffee that tasted like regret and a social worker named Janet, who specialized in helping families navigate the bureaucracy of medical emergencies. The charity care application requires a co-signer, Janet explained, spreading forms across the cafeteria table like a dealer shuffling cards for a game where everyone was trying not to lose. Someone who can guarantee compliance with the treatment plan and provide a stable environment for recovery. I can do that, Emma said, signing her name on a line that felt like signing up for a responsibility she'd been avoiding for 8 years. It also requires an address. Your father listed the Sacred Heart Shelter, but they can't discharge him back to a homeless shelter after cardiac surgery. He needs a place where he can rest, take medication on schedule, attend follow-up appointments. Emma looked at her signature on the form, Emma Chen, and realized she'd been signing the wrong name. She crossed it out and wrote Emma Rivera in handwriting that looked like her father's, like the genetics of penmanship were stronger than 8 years of practice at being someone else's daughter. He can stay with me, she said, temporarily, until he's back on his feet. Janet nodded and made notes in a file that would become part of Marcus Rivera's medical record, a paper trail that documented the moment his daughter decided to save his life, whether she was ready to forgive him or not. The surgery took 3 hours. Emma sat in the waiting room and called in sick to her job at a community center, where she taught after-school programs to kids whose parents worked 2 jobs and couldn't afford childcare. She called her adoptive parents, Peter and Linda Chen, and tried to explain why she was at the hospital with the father who'd abandoned her instead of at work with the kids who depended on her. Sweetheart, Linda said, voice careful in the way that meant she was trying not to say the thing she really wanted to say. Are you sure about this? You don't owe him anything. I know I don't owe him anything, Emma said. But he's my father, and he's sick, and I'm the only family he has left. You have us, Peter said, taking the phone from his wife. You've had us for 8 years. We adopted you, Emma. Legally, emotionally, completely. You don't have to go backward just because he showed up. Emma looked around the waiting room at families holding vigil for people they loved, and people they felt obligated to love and people they were trying to decide whether to love again. I'm not going backward, she said. I'm going forward with more information. When the surgeon came to tell her the operation had been successful, Emma was asleep in a chair with her head on a table, dreaming of equations that solved themselves and houses that didn't get lost to gambling debts and fathers who showed up to school plays, even when they were more interested in the mathematics of stage lighting than in the performance of their daughters. The foster home that wasn't home. Emma drove to her apartment after the surgery to pack a bag for herself and clear space for a man she hadn't spoken to in 8 years, who was about to become her roommate, whether either of them was ready for that particular mathematical proof. Her apartment was small, a studio with a Murphy bed and a kitchenette and windows that faced another building whose windows faced back, but it was hers in a way that the Chen family house had never quite been, despite their love and generosity and 8 years of trying to make her feel like she belonged there completely. She moved her desk to make room for a cot she borrowed from the community center. She cleared drawer space in the bathroom for medication bottles. She bought groceries for someone whose dietary restrictions were whatever doesn't cost too much, and whose medication would probably require food that was healthier than ramen and coffee and the protein bars she ate when she was too busy helping other people to remember to help herself. While she reorganized her life around the mathematics of caregiving, she thought about the Chens and the 8 years they'd given her and the way they'd never asked her to forget Marcus Rivera, but had made it easy to pretend he'd never existed. They'd been perfect foster parents and then perfect adoptive parents, patient with her anger, supportive of her education, proud of her choice to study social work, even though it meant she'd never make enough money to be comfortable. They'd given her stability and consistency, and the kind of love that didn't come with conditions or gambling debts or midnight disappearances, but they'd also given her a new name and a new identity, and a new story about herself that didn't include the first 14 years of her life. And sometimes Emma wondered if they'd saved her from her father or from herself. The phone rang while she was making the cot with sheets that smelled like the laundromat and hope. It was the hospital. "Ms. Rivera, this is Dr. Martinez. Your father is awake and he's asking for you." Emma looked around her apartment, reorganized for a man who'd lost the right to her care 8 years ago, stocked with food for someone who'd taught her that love wasn't reliable, prepared for a recovery that would require forgiveness she wasn't sure she knew how to give. "I'll be right there," she said. Marcus looked smaller in the hospital bed, connected to machines that monitored his heartbeat and IV lines that delivered medication and hope in measured doses. His hair was more gray than Emma remembered, his face more lined, his hands thinner but still recognizable as the hands that had helped her with homework and taught her to solve for X when X was the thing you couldn't see but knew had to be there. "How do you feel?" she asked, settling into the chair beside his bed. "Like I got hit by a truck full of mathematics," Marcus said, voice hoarse, from the breathing tube they'd removed an hour earlier. "But alive, thanks to you. Thanks to aspirin and paramedics and a surgeon who knew what she was doing. Thanks to a daughter who became a medical volunteer and happened to be in the right place at the right time to save her father's life." Marcus looked at her with eyes that were clearer than they'd been in the shelter, maybe because of the medication or maybe because nearly dying had simplified the mathematics of what mattered. "That's either the best coincidence in history or the worst." "I don't believe in coincidences," Emma said. "I believe in probability and circumstance, and the fact that if you're homeless in this city long enough, you'll eventually end up at one of the 3 shelters where I volunteer." "You volunteer at 3 shelters?" "Sacred Heart on Tuesdays, St. Vincent's on Thursdays, Unity House on Saturdays. I've been looking for you for 2 years, without admitting I was looking for you." Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing the mathematics of intentional accidents and daughters who inherited their father's inability to say what they meant directly. "Why?" "Because I needed to know you were alive, and because I needed to know you were okay, and because I needed to know that if something happened to you it wouldn't be because I could have helped and chose not to. And now something did happen to me, and now I'm helping whether I want to or not. Do you want to?" Emma looked at her father, sick, vulnerable, dependent on her kindness and her willingness to sign papers that made her responsible for his recovery, and realized that the question wasn't whether she wanted to help him. The question was whether she wanted to be the kind of person who could turn away from someone who needed help, just because helping was complicated. "I want you to get better," she said. "I want you to take your medication and go to your follow-up appointments and learn how to live without gambling. Away everything you care about. I want you to be okay. And after I'm okay? I don't know. We'll figure out that math when we get there. Trial by mathematics." The discharge process took 2 days and required forms that documented everything from Marcus's current address, Emma's apartment, to his support system, Emma, to his plan for maintaining sobriety, Daily NA meetings, weekly therapy, and the kind of accountability that comes from living with someone who's already given you one more chance than you deserved. Emma took a leave of absence from her job to manage his recovery, which meant living on savings and the small stipend she got from her volunteer work, and the mathematics of making $30 stretch to cover groceries for 2 people and medication that cost more than her rent. The first week was the hardest. Marcus slept most of the time, waking only to take pills that made him nauseous and eat food that tasted like cardboard and apologize for disrupting Emma's life in ways that couldn't be solved with equations or good intentions. Emma developed a routine: medication at 8 a.m., 2 p.m., and 8 p.m., light exercise, walking to the corner and back, heart-healthy meals that required creativity when the main ingredients were whatever was on sale and whatever didn't require too much salt or fat or optimism. They didn't talk much during that first week. Emma because she was afraid that if she started talking she'd say things she couldn't take back, and Marcus because he was afraid that if he started talking, he'd say too much about the 8 years he'd spent thinking about what he'd lost, and not enough about what he was willing to do to earn back what could be earned back. The second week was better. Marcus stayed awake longer, helped with simple tasks like folding laundry and washing dishes, and began the slow process of remembering how to be a person who lived indoors and had routines and ate meals at regular times. He also started tutoring again, meeting students at the library and charging $15 an hour because his daughter was supporting him, and the least he could do was contribute to the mathematics of their shared expenses. Tyler's mother asked if I wanted to tutor his sister too, Marcus told Emma over dinner on a Tuesday night. Apparently word is getting around that the homeless math teacher isn't actually dangerous, just poor. What did you tell her? I told her I'd need to check with my parole officer. Emma looked up from her pasta. You don't have a parole officer. I know, but I do have a daughter who's responsible for making sure I don't disappear again, which is basically the same thing. Emma almost smiled. I'm not your parole officer. What are you then? It was a good question, and Emma didn't have a mathematical formula for the answer. She was his daughter, but she'd also been the Chen's daughter for 8 years. She was his caregiver, but temporarily and out of necessity rather than love. She was his roommate, but only until he was healthy enough to live independently. She was his second chance, but she hadn't decided yet whether second chances were something she believed in. I'm figuring it out, she said. The third week brought unexpected complications. A social worker named David knocked on Emma's door with a clipboard and questions about Marcus's living situation and whether a 22-year-old with no experience in elder care was qualified to be responsible for a man with a serious heart condition and a history of addiction. I'm not elderly, Marcus said from the couch where he was working on calculus problems for Tyler's sister. I'm 53 and recovering from a minor cardiac event. I don't need elder care. I need someone to remind me to take my medication and drive me to appointments until my cardiologist clears me to take public transportation. David made notes that looked like the kind of notes that preceded decisions Emma wouldn't like. Mr. Rivera, your medical records indicate a history of homelessness, gambling addiction, and non-compliance with previous treatment recommendations. The county has programs specifically designed for individuals with your risk factors. What kind of programs? Emma asked, though she already knew the answer would involve group homes and supervised living, and the kind of structure that felt like prison when you'd spent 6 years sleeping on streets that didn't ask questions about your past. Transitional, housing with on-site medical support, mandatory counseling, daily check-ins. It's designed to ensure compliance and prevent relapse. Marcus set down his pencil and looked at Emma with eyes that asked whether she was ready to fight for him or ready to let someone else take responsibility for the mathematics of his recovery. He's compliant, Emma said. He takes his medication on schedule. He attends his appointments. He's building a stable income through tutoring. He doesn't need institutional supervision. Ms. Rivera, you're young, and you have your own life to consider. Taking care of a parent with multiple risk factors is a significant responsibility. Are you sure you're prepared for that long term? Emma looked at her father, who was trying not to look like he was holding his breath waiting for her answer. She thought about the Chens, who had given her 8 years of stability and love and support. She thought about the job she'd taken leave from, and the life she'd built, and the identity she'd constructed around being someone who helped other people's families instead of fixing her own. She thought about the mathematics of obligation and choice, and the compound interest of love that doesn't stop calculating, even when the numbers don't add up to easy answers. "I'm not taking care of a parent with multiple risk factors," she said. "I'm taking care of my father, who had a heart attack and needs support while he recovers. There's a difference." David made more notes. "I'll need to schedule follow-up visits to ensure the arrangement is working for both of you." After he left, Marcus closed his notebook and looked at Emma with an expression that was part gratitude and part terror. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Emma said. "Not because I owe you anything, but because you're my father, and I'm not ready to let strangers make decisions about your life while I'm still figuring out what role I want to play in it." "And what role do you want to play?" Emma was quiet for a moment, thinking about roles and relationships and the mathematics of forgiveness that doesn't come with instruction manuals or guarantee of successful outcomes. "I want to be your daughter," she said finally. "Not the daughter I was when I was 14 and you were disappearing. Not the daughter the Chens raised me to be when I was trying to forget you existed. I want to be the daughter I am now, at 22, with all the information I have about who you were and who you're trying to become. And what does that daughter look like? I don't know yet. We're both going to have to figure out that math together." The answer, written in stars. 6 months later, Emma returned to work part-time and Marcus moved into a studio apartment 3 blocks away from hers. Not because he was ready to live completely independently, but because they'd learned that recovery worked better when it came with privacy and the option to choose each other's company, rather than being forced into it by medical necessity. Marcus's tutoring business grew to include 12 regular students and a small math camp. He ran out of the community center where Emma worked. His income wasn't enough to live comfortably, but it was enough to pay rent and buy groceries and contribute to the cost of the medication that kept his heart beating in regular rhythm. Emma kept volunteering at the shelters, but she also started a program that connected homeless individuals with chronic health conditions to volunteer medical students who could provide basic care and help navigate the bureaucracy of charity healthcare. They had dinner together once a week, usually on Sundays, at Emma's apartment or Marcus's, or sometimes at a restaurant when they were feeling optimistic about their financial mathematics. They talked about Emma's work and Marcus's students and the weather and current events, and gradually, carefully, about the 8 years they'd spent apart and the ways they'd both changed and the ways they'd stayed the same. They didn't talk about forgiveness as a concept or an achievement or a gift Emma could choose to give or withhold. They talked about forgiveness as a practice, like physical therapy for relationships, something that required daily attention and incremental progress, and the understanding that healing wasn't the same as forgetting. On a Tuesday night in March, Emma got a call from Sacred Heart Shelter. A new volunteer needed training on medical procedures, and would she be willing to come in and show someone the basics of blood pressure monitoring and wound care, and how to ask about symptoms without making people feel like medical specimens? Emma arrived at the shelter to find Marcus sitting at the intake table with a clipboard and a pen, wearing a volunteer badge that said Marcus Math Tutor, and talking to a teenager about algebra homework. "What are you doing here?" Emma asked. "Volunteering," Marcus said. "Turns out they need someone to help people with forms and applications and the kind of basic math that's required to navigate social services. Also, I know this place pretty well from the client side, so I can explain how things work without making people feel stupid for not knowing." Emma looked around the shelter. At the coffee station where she'd recognized her father 6 months earlier, at the medical table where she'd taken his blood pressure and started the process of becoming his daughter again, at the intake desk where he was now, helping other people solve the mathematics of survival. "How long have you been doing this?" 2 months. I asked if they needed help and they said yes, and I said I had experience with homelessness and a PhD in mathematics and a daughter who could vouch for my reliability. "You used me as a reference?" "I used you as proof that I'm capable of showing up for people I care about, even when it's complicated." Emma sat down at the table where they'd had their first conversation in 8 years, where she'd learned that her father was homeless and he'd learned that she'd become someone who volunteered at shelters looking for him, without admitting that's what she was doing. "Are you happy?" she asked. Marcus looked around the shelter, at the people who were homeless like he'd been and the volunteers who were helping like she'd been, and the space where need met generosity and sometimes created something that looked like community. "I'm useful," he said. "I'm sober. I'm housed. I have work. that matters, and a daughter who answers when I call, and a cardiologist who says my heart is stronger than it was before the attack. He paused. I don't know if that's the same as happy, but it's the same as grateful. Grateful for what? For you. For second chances. For the mathematics of coincidence that put us in the same place at the same time when I needed you most. Marcus closed his notebook and looked at his daughter. For learning that some equations don't have solutions. They have relationships. Emma looked at her father. Volunteer, tutor, recovering addict, heart attack survivor. Man who counted stars because numbers had always been easier than feelings, until feelings became necessary for survival, and realized that forgiveness wasn't something she'd given him like a gift. It was something they'd built together, like a bridge made of small choices and daily kindnesses, and the mathematics of showing up for each other even when showing up was complicated. Dad, she said, using the word for the first time in 8 years, do you want to help me train the new volunteer? Yes, Marcus said, and the word sounded like an equation that had finally found its solution. Outside, the city moved through its evening routines. People walking home from work, streetlights flickering on, stars appearing in the spaces between buildings where light pollution hadn't completely conquered darkness. Inside Sacred Heart Shelter, a father and daughter worked side by side, helping strangers navigate the mathematics of survival and the possibility that tomorrow might be different from today. Marcus Rivera counted things differently now. Days since his last bet, 217. Medication doses taken on schedule, 368. Conversations with his daughter that didn't end in tears or silence, 42 and growing. Stars visible from the roof of his apartment building, more than he'd expected when he started looking up instead of down. Emma Rivera Chen, she'd hyphenated her name because some mathematics required acknowledging all the variables, counted things differently too. People helped at the shelter, students taught in her after-school program, dinners shared with her father, moments when forgiveness felt less like work and more like breathing. They didn't count the years they'd lost or the mistakes that couldn't be undone or the what-ifs that led to problems without solutions. They counted forward, appointments kept, promises made and honored, small acts of love that added up to something larger than either of them had been able to create alone. And if someone had asked them to solve for X in the equation of their relationship, they would have said that X wasn't a number you could isolate and solve for. X was the variable that changed based on all the other variables: time, effort, honesty, hope, the daily choice to show up for each other even when showing up was hard. X was the answer written in stars, visible only. When you stopped looking down at your mistakes long enough to look up at the possibility that tomorrow could be different from yesterday, and that different might be exactly the kind of mathematics that made sense when nothing else did.